Sometimes in your search for happiness, you ponder the meaning of your life.
And what is the truth?
You sift your memory for beginnings.
The truth.
You send your mind ahead for directions.
Truth.
But all you really know is now, and you are lost in the present.
And what is the truth?
Well, now, here's a man who wants to get right down to it. Kind of anxious to get to it, are you? Whatever.
Yes, that's right. Welcome back to the History of Being Human podcast. I'm the host, Noel Armstrong. Once again, anxious to get right down to it. Still trying to resurrect sense and meaning from the dust of a billion factoids, trying to figure out who we are by looking at where we've been and what we've done. Remember to write me at thobhpodcast@gmail.com. That's right, all of the letters in The History of Being Human, then podcast@gmail.com. Thank you to those of you who have taken time to reach out, to give me corrections, feedback, some of it positive, most of it positive. I have to say, I really appreciate a lot of the positive feedback I've gotten. I also appreciate, and I have to say this honestly, I appreciate the feedback offering suggestions for ways to improve the show. In this episode, we continue with our series within a series, our series on Joan of Arc within our greater series on the Inquisition. As I said, Joan of Arc is the most famous person ever to be condemned by the Inquisition. And as far as I can tell, she's utterly unique in one way. She's the only person, I think, in all of history to ever have been condemned and burned alive and later canonized as a saint by the selfsame institution, the Catholic Church. Today we're going to be talking about the life of Joan of Arc. In the previous episode, we talked a little bit about the background, the 100 Years' War into which Joan was born. I think you could make a pretty convincing case that this period of time, the 100 Years' War, and of course the Black Death that briefly interrupted the fighting, was one of the darkest, bleakest times in the history of Europe, with the nobility from these two powerhouse nations just slugging it out in a state of perpetual warfare. And of course, the peasantry was trapped in the middle of all of this, without really a dog in the fight. Sure, they took one side or the other, but these were not their concerns. They wanted to raise their crops, raise their animals, get married, have children, and yet they were surrounded by these powerful militant forces that would occasionally drive them off their land, burn their villages, steal their food, and basically completely uproot and destabilize their lives. And one of those peasants was Joan of Arc, one of the most amazing people to ever be born. In fact, I will quote Mark Twain. Now, if you know Mark Twain, you know that he was a genius, and he was not given to sentimentality or hyperbole. He was not a fanboy. He didn't jump on the bandwagon for these great historical figures, with one notable exception, and that was Joan of Arc. This is what he said, Mark Twain said about Joan of Arc. Quote, "Joan was easily and by far the most extraordinary person the human race has ever produced." End quote. That's pretty high praise from Mark Twain, one of the most erudite figures in American letters. A man who, we have to admit, loved to poke fun at Catholics and the French, going all in, sounding like a giddy schoolboy about Joan of Arc, calling her easily and by far the most extraordinary person ever. And while I can't claim to know enough about life, the universe, and everything to go quite that far, I do know that Joan of Arc was extraordinary. So today on the History of Being Human podcast, we'll talk about the biography, the life of Joan of Arc up until the time of her trial. Last time was the intro, the 100 Years' War. Next time will be the trial of Joan of Arc. Today we'll just talk about what she did in her short life that earned her these kind of accolades. Joan, who had become Joan of Arc, was probably born in 1412. She herself didn't know the date of her own birth, but around the time of her death in 1431, she said she thought she was about 19 years old. Joan was born about 85 years into the 100 Years' War, which, as we said, was 116 years. I want to ease into Joan's story by taking a moment to talk about the prince with whom her own life was so intertwined, the Crown Prince Charles VII. Charles VII was born in 1403. That's 9 years before Joan herself was born, so he's 9 years older than Joan of Arc. And his family tree is a little tough to figure out because not only was he the 11th child and 5th son of Mad King Charles and Isabeau of Bavaria, 2 of his older brothers were named Charles also. They had died. So he's the 3rd Charles, the 5th son, and the 11th child of the Mad King and Isabeau of Bavaria. All of his older brothers had been the crown prince in their own time, and all of them had died, leaving him, Charles VII, with a rich collection of titles that would have been shared with his older brothers had they lived. And as we covered in the last episode, his mother Isabeau of Bavaria was very close to, and many say lovers with, Duke Louis I of Orleans. So rumors that Charles VII was actually the son of Duke Louis of Orleans instead of the Glass King would persist throughout his life. The reason for that is that the Mad King Charles was semi-incapacitated for a lot of the time around Charles VII's birth. Now, Henry V came through France, besieging many cities, capturing lands in the year 1417, and by that time, all of Charles VII's older brothers were dead. This left Charles VII as the Dauphin, or as they say in English, the Dolphin. Now you, dear listener, might be wondering, like I wondered, why they would call the Crown Prince of France the Dolphin. Why not call him Charles the Muskox, or Charles the Wombat, or Charles the Cabbage for that matter? Why the Dolphin? What does that have to do with anything? Apparently, it has to do with a region in eastern France called the Viennois that was given to the heir apparent, the Crown Prince of France, to rule over. That area, the Viennois, had a coat of arms with dolphins on it. And because of this dolphin coat of arms, the ruler of the area was called the Dauphin des Viennois. So the short answer is, there's a region in eastern France with a dolphin coat of arms that the Crown Prince of France was given to rule over, so he was called the Dolphin. So when Charles VII's older brothers died at the ages of 0, 9, 17, and 19 years old, they were all dead by the year 1417, and that's when Charles VII became the Crown Prince, the Dolphin. And being the Crown Prince came as more of a burden than a gift to the young Charles. He was only 14 years old at the time. Almost immediately after becoming Dauphin, Charles had threats, one after another, to his inheritance that he was forced to face. On the 29th of May, 1418, John the Fearless and the Burgundians entered the city of Paris and captured it. The Dauphin was forced to flee and set up his own parliament in Poitiers. About a year later, the Burgundians, under John the Fearless, wanted to negotiate a power-sharing agreement with Charles VII. So John the Fearless comes to a meeting with Charles VII, and Charles VII's men attack and kill John the Fearless. And so the entire nation is plunged into a civil war. There is no hope of reconciliation between the two most powerful factions in France, the Burgundians, formerly under John the Fearless, and the followers of Charles VII, the Dauphin, who were called the Armagnacs. So France was effectively in a civil war. That allowed Henry V to rampage and pillage his way through the countryside and have himself declared regent of all France, and his son Henry VI declared future king of all France. Now, as I said, Charles VII and most of the French nobility did not find it acceptable that an Englishman was going to be their king. So Charles VII and those who followed him claimed that he still held the title of future king of France, and that was all well and good, but he did nothing to back up that claim. He took up residence in the small town of Bourges in the Loire Valley, and so he was derisively called the King of Bourges. Nobody took him seriously. He mounted no military campaigns against the Burgundians or against the English for that matter. And around the time Joan of Arc came on the scene, his main strategic planning seemed to be planning how he could get out of there, how he could escape. He was trying to decide whether he should go to Iberia, to Spain, or if he should flee to Scotland to escape the English. The France he ruled over was a shadow of its former glory. The Burgundians and English held Belgium, northern France, eastern France, southwestern France, and Charles VII was just paralyzed by a sense of futility. He was a king in exile, and the walls were closing in around him as the English and Burgundians were on the march. They controlled Paris, Rouen, and the Burgundians controlled Reims. Now, why is that important? That's important because kings were traditionally coronated in the city of Reims. If the Burgundians held it, if Charles VII couldn't make it there, he could claim to be king, but he would never be coronated king in Reims, so nobody would recognize his claim. So things weren't looking very good for the Dauphin for Charles VII in his late teens and early 20s. In the year 1428, though, things would look even worse. Impossible as it sounds, things got worse. That's because the English began to besiege the city of Orleans. This was the last stronghold loyal to Charles VII, the most important city left that he had any influence over. If Orleans felt nothing would have stopped the English, Charles and his claim to kingship would have had to load up a carriage in the middle of the night and ride for the border. I think it's no exaggeration at all to say that the Dauphin's claim to the kingship of France was down to its last gasp. It was on life support. I said in a previous episode that the 100 Years' War would have been the 500 Years' War if Joan hadn't come along, but actually, I think the opposite is true. I think I was 100% wrong. If Joan hadn't come along, the 100 Years' War would have ended in the year 1428 with a resounding English victory. Orleans falls, Charles runs, and the English take over the rest of France. Little did Charles know that help was coming. Someone who would do for Charles what he was powerless to do for himself. And no, it's not one of the descendants of Genghis Khan riding in with the Mongol hordes. It's help from the most unlikely source imaginable. Never fear, Charles. A super religious zealot teenage cowgirl from a small peasant village is going to come bail you out. Nothing would have been more reassuring to the Dauphin. She has tons of experience going to mass every single day of the week, being nice to people, spinning wool, baking. So there's nothing to worry about. But of course, as we already know, this was no ordinary peasant. This was Joan of Arc. And she would be exactly the help he needed. She would not only save his claim to the kingship of France, she would begin a movement. She would win a series of victories that would end up uniting France and driving the English occupiers out. Joan was born in the small town of Domremy, which I think was in the Fasolatido province. Domremy was officially part of the Burgundian territory, but its population didn't like the Burgundians, didn't like the English. They remained loyal to Charles VII, to the Dauphin. Joan's father was a man named Jacques d'Arc, Jack of Arc. He wasn't rich, but he wasn't destitute either. He owned 50 acres, and he held a semi-prestigious position of sergeant of the village, which means he was in charge of the local watch, the local guard. You can look up online, or you can actually go visit the house that he lived in, the house that Joan was born in. And even though it's not fancy, it really is quite cozy looking. Joan's mother was a woman named Isabelle Romee, and Romee might have meant that she took a pilgrimage to Rome at some point. Now, if indeed her mother did take a pilgrimage to Rome, it meant two things. One, that she was very pious, and two, that she had some form of financial security. You couldn't undertake that kind of pilgrimage if you were living hand to mouth. When Joan was born, her parents already had a family of 4, 3 boys and 1 other girl. Joan was born around the year 1412, as we said, when Charles the Dauphin was 9 years old. We call her Joan of Arc, but she didn't call herself that. She probably would have taken her mother's name, but Joan only referred to herself as the maiden, La Pucelle. She didn't refer to herself as Joan of Arc. She grew up in a pretty uneventful way. She would have been raised like any other respectable peasant girl. From her father, she would have learned to farm, to tend the animals. But her father was pretty strict, and from all accounts, she wasn't very close to her father. She was closer to Isabel, her mother. From her mother, she would have learned to spin and sew, and it's said that she was actually very good at this kind of work, a deft hand at spinning and sewing. Joan was very pious from a very young age. We have the testimony of her own mother. This is a first-person statement from Isabelle Romee. And of course, this was given during her trial to rehabilitate her after she'd been condemned of heresy. So it emphasizes her religious upbringing. But this is what Joan's mother, Isabel, says about her. Quote, "I had a daughter born in lawful wedlock who grew up amid the fields and pastures. I had her baptized and confirmed, and brought her up in the fear of God. I taught her respect for the traditions of the church as much as I was able to do, given her age and simplicity of her condition. I succeeded so well that she spent much of her time in church, and after having gone to confession, she received the sacrament of the Eucharist every month. Because the people suffered so much, she had a great compassion for them in her heart, and despite her youth, she would fast and pray for them with great devotion and fervor. She never thought, spoke, or did anything against the faith." End quote. So it indeed appears that Joan was quite religious from a very young age. In fact, other kids would tease her about going to Mass instead of playing or doing something else. But remember, these were very religious times. So Joan was not actually considered a freak or some kind of outlier. She was just a pious peasant. And if Joan would have been born into different circumstances, she probably would have lived a very normal life. Respected good wife of the village, raised her children to be devout, a good source of advice, a good friend, somebody who was excellent at cooking and weaving, who lived and died surrounded by friends, children, and grandchildren. But Joan's life would deviate from that comfortable course. By the time she was 13 years old, that's when she had her first visions. In 1425, Joan is 13, and there was a raid on her village in Domremy. Some of the sheep were stolen. This was no great tragedy. Nobody starved to death. They were able to rescue some of the sheep. But the point is that her father was the sergeant of the village, and the villagers were of the opinion that the whole thing was the fault of the English. They were sick to death of the war and blamed it on the English occupation. They wanted the English out. Joan, as the daughter of the sergeant of the village, would have heard all of them carping against the English, saying basically that there would never be peace until the English were driven from the lands of France. And shortly after that raid, Joan was in her father's garden, which lay between the house and the church. Joan says that as she looked to her left toward the church, there shined a shining being. A glorious personage appeared, a being of light surrounded by other beings of light. Somehow or other, she recognized this being as the Archangel Michael, and she was initially terrified, but over time she began to be comforted by these visions. Eventually, the Archangel Michael told her that God was going to send her two other saints, St. Catherine and St. Margaret. They were going to tell her what she should do, that she needed to listen to them and be a good girl. And sure enough, in time, St. Catherine and St. Margaret appeared to Joan of Arc. Some historians have pointed out the fact that Joan's older sister was named Catherine, and in the church at Domremy was a statue of St. Margaret. So Joan would have grown up around these names. But whatever the cause was, Joan listened to St. Catherine and St. Margaret and took them as her guides for the rest of her entire life. Now initially, all that St. Catherine and St. Margaret asked her to do was essentially to be ready to help the King of France. Joan was smart enough to know, even at the age of 13, that she didn't need to spread the word about what she was seeing. She kept these visions to herself. She didn't tell anyone for years afterward. She wasn't the kind of person who said, God spoke to me, I'm very important, you have to listen to me and do everything I say. In fact, when she had to establish her divine mission with Charles the Dauphin, she told him very briefly about her visions. At her trial, when she was forced to speak about them, she spoke even more reluctantly. Joan was always very discreet about her voices and her messengers. She never told anyone, in fact, exactly how they appeared or exactly how they spoke to her, how she heard them. What we do know is that she heard these voices for 3 years, and they became progressively more insistent that she had to save France, but they gave her no specifics. I have to kind of feel sorry for Joan at this point. She had this great secret. She couldn't tell anybody that God was telling her she had to save France. They would have thought she was crazy. So she's living outwardly a very normal life, spinning, sewing, washing, cooking, cleaning, all the things a peasant girl is supposed to do. Love going to church, being with her friends, and yet all the time inside she's carrying the weight of an insane, very lonely burden that her voice has put on her to save all of France. You get an idea for what a strong person she must have been. And she, frankly, had to be strong. In the year 1428, when Joan is 16, two events would occur which would lead to Joan's voices being much more definitive, much more insistent about exactly what they wanted Joan to do. The first event was that now that Joan was 16, there was a young man in the village who wanted to marry her. He thought he had a claim to being betrothed to Joan, and it even appears that Joan's parents favored this young man. Joan, of course, was being called another way by her voices, so she flatly refused this young man. Now, these were very different times. This young man, let's call him Gaston, would not take no for an answer. If she wouldn't marry him voluntarily, he'd sue her and force her to marry him. So he went to the ecclesiastical court in Toul, and there he filed a claim of betrothal. And Joan had to go to Toul to defend herself against marrying this young man that she didn't want to marry. Joan says that her voices told her before she even went that she would prevail in the case, and indeed she did. The judges dismissed the lawsuit of her suitor, and Joan was not forced to marry him. Now, another event that occurred right around that same time, in that summer of 1428, was that Joan's village was attacked. In the whole east of France, there was only one town that held out for Charles VII. That was the town of Vaucouleurs. That was 13 miles north from where Joan lived in Domremy. The English and Burgundians decided to besiege the town of Vaucouleurs. So they're going to besiege this town 13 miles north of her small village of Domremy. The captain of the town of Vaucouleurs, a man named Robert of Baudricourt, decided he would defend the town of Vaucouleurs, but he couldn't do anything to defend the smaller towns in the countryside round about. And that meant that Joan's village of Domremy was right in the path of the advancing Anglo-Burgundian army. So this army is going to march right through the area of Joan's hometown of Domremy. Now, when an army marches through your town on its way to a siege, they steal all the food they can get, all the cattle, all the grain, everything they can get their hands on. So the citizens, the peasants of Domremy, knew they had to get out of the way of this army. They had to try to preserve whatever food and cattle they had. So they marched south to the town of Neufchâteau, and there they hid out until the army passed. After the army passed, the villagers of Domremy drove all their cattle back home. When they came back to the town, they found that the entire town had been burned. The Anglo-Burgundian forces didn't take kindly to the peasants fleeing with all their food, so they burned the village. Now, luckily for the people of Domremy, their houses were made of stone, the roofs were thatch. It was the middle of the summer, so they just rebuilt their roofs. No great loss. But after the burning of her village and the lawsuit from her suitor, her would-be suitor at Toul, the commands given to Joan by her voices became much more definite. That's when they told her for the first time she had to go to Charles VII and help him reconquer his kingdom, drive the English out of France. Now, it's easy to look back in hindsight and say, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. But imagine that you were Joan. Imagine that there was no precedent for what these voices were asking you to do. It would be about like being, a stylist somewhere in North Korea. And voices come to you telling you, you have to throw the Kim family out of North Korea. How do you process this? Has anything like this ever happened before or since in history? I can't think of it. Maybe Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr. are the closest I can come. But Joan was totally unique. She heard very definite voices commanding her to do very definite things. She didn't question or argue. She did exactly what they told her to do. Now, Joan might not have gotten along very well with her father, Jacques, but he seems to have had a little mysticism of his own. In fact, during one of Joan's trials, it came up that her father was having dreams that she was going to run away. Joan was asked this question at her trial of condemnation, quote, "Did not your father have dreams about you before your departure?" Joan responds, "When I was still with my father and mother, my mother told me many times that my father had spoken of having dreamed that I, Jeanette, his daughter, went away with the men-at-arms. My father and mother took great care to keep me safe and held me much in subjection. I obeyed them in everything except in the case at Toul, the action for marriage. I have heard my mother say that my father told my brothers, 'Truly, if I had thought this thing would happen that I have dreamed about my daughter, I would wish you to drown her. And if you would not do it, I would drown her myself.' He," Joan's father, "nearly lost his senses when I went to Vaucouleurs." End quote. So Joan's father very much feared that she was going to run away on him and said that he would rather have her drowned than see her go off to join the men-at-arms. But even that did not dissuade Joan. This, of course, brings us to Vaucouleurs. Joan now had a clear directive. She now knew the duty that these voices had been preparing her for the past 3 years. She had to somehow get to the Dauphin, the crown prince. She had to break the siege at Orleans, and she had to take Charles VII to Reims to be coronated king. And it's telling that instead of shirking or being afraid of this duty, afraid of this calling, Joan couldn't be kept from it. In fact, she gave this quote at her trial about her attitude around these matters. Quote, "Every man gives his life for what he believes. Every woman gives her life for what she believes. Sometimes people believe in little or nothing. Nevertheless, they give up their lives to that little or nothing. One life is all we have, and we live it as we believe in living it, and then it's gone. But to surrender what you are and live without belief, that's more terrible than dying. More terrible than dying young." End quote. So in 1428, at the age of 16, Joan did what her father had been fearing for a long time. She left home and persuaded a relative to take her to the town of Vaucouleurs. Remember, that was the town 13 miles to the north of her village that still held out for Charles VII. So there she showed up. She didn't even meet Baudricourt. She just sent word to him that she wanted to speak to him. He asked what it was about. She told the soldier to tell him that she was there to save France, and he just sent her home. Didn't even meet with her. Told her to get lost. Go back to her spinning. Unfortunately for Joan, there was nothing she could do about it. She was forced to return home to Domremy, having not met with Robert of Baudricourt. Well, of course, Joan wouldn't let it rest, so she returned in January of 1429, just a couple of months later. And this time she gained the trust of a couple of soldiers. One of them was a man named Jean de Metz. Jean reports that even though Joan had never met Robert of Baudricourt, she went right up to him. During her trial, Joan said, quote, "I recognized him," meaning Robert of Baudricourt, because my voice told me. It said to me, there he is, end quote. Luckily, we have first-hand account from Jean de Metz, that soldier whose trust Joan had gained, of what was said between Joan and Robert of Baudricourt. She said, quote, I must be at the king's side. There will be no help for the kingdom if not from me. Although I would rather have remained spinning wool at my mother's side, yet must I go, and must I do this thing, for my Lord wills that I do so, end quote. It seems that at this first meeting with Robert of Baudricourt, Joan told him that Orleans would be delivered, that Charles VII would be crowned king at Reims, and that she was the one who was going to help bring that about. Now, according to the stories and the accounts around her meeting with Robert of Baudricourt, he remained skeptical. So while Joan stayed in Vaucouleurs, she told Robert, listen, mark my words, Robert, there's going to be a military reversal at the Battle of Rouvray. You're going to hear about it in a few days. Then you'll know that I'm right, that I have this divine commission. And sure enough, just as Joan had predicted, messengers arrived within a few days, confirming exactly what Joan had predicted to him. So Robert began to suspect that something special, something miraculous was happening here. Robert agreed to take Joan to meet the crown prince, who was at the time in the town of Chinon. Now that would mean traveling through hostile Burgundian territory, and Robert and the men with her thought it would be best for her to disguise herself as a male to avoid attention as they traveled through that territory. So the people of Vaucouleurs provided Joan with men's clothing and suggested that she wear it as she rode to meet the crown prince in the town of Chinon. And this would become pivotal, because wearing men's clothes was strictly forbidden by the church at that time. So when Joan goes to trial, she'll be accused of being a traitor, a witch, an infidel, a sorceress, all kinds of things. But the charge that she won't be able to wriggle out of, the charge that will stick, will be the most trivial and idiotic charge of all. And we'll get back to that. Anyway, Joan travels under the protection of Robert of Baudricourt to the town of Chinon through Burgundian territory dressed as a man. When they arrive in early January, Charles is 26, Joan is 17. He hears that she's coming. He hears that she has miraculously predicted one of the battles during the siege of Orleans. So he conceals himself in the crowd to test her, I guess. And it's said that Joan picks him out immediately, walks right up to him in the presence of 300 other courtiers and kneels to him. According to Joan, quote, when I entered the chamber of the king, I recognized him among the others on account of my voices, which revealed him to me, end quote. Again, you have to ask what's going on here. How could she do these things? It gets even stranger. After she's able to pick him out of the crowd, Charles grants her a private audience with him. During that private audience, she's able to win the trust of the crown prince. How does she do it? Well, according to Joan and Charles, she won his trust because during the private audience she had with him, she told him the very words of a prayer that he had said in his oratory when he was all alone. Now you have to wonder again what's happening here. You could say Charles was lying, trying to motivate his troops, but nobody would impugn Joan of Arc's motive. She was honest to a fault. Even when it cost her dearly, she was honest, and she reported the same thing. Her voices told her the words that Charles had offered during his own private prayer. So according to both of them, this happened. Things are already getting a little spooky with Joan. But believe it or not, they're about to get even more uncanny. Charles is so impressed with Joan that he agrees to let her ride with his army to relieve the siege at Orleans. She tells him, essentially, that if she doesn't ride, there's no hope for the army. If she goes with them, then she can help them break the siege. Charles has nothing to lose, so he sends Joan with the relieving army, provides her with a horse and armor. And again, this is where it gets even more weird. One of the things that he offered Joan was a sword. Joan refuses the sword. She says, this isn't the sword that my voice has told me I'm supposed to carry. My voice has told me I am to carry the sword of Charles the Hammer, Charles Martel, which would be no small feat, because Charles Martel was the grandfather of Charlemagne, and he had been dead for about 700 years around the time that Joan was asking to carry his sword. No problem, Joan's voices told her where to find that sword. It would be buried behind the altar at the church of St. Catherine of Fierbois. Charles sends men who go to the church, dig behind the altar, and sure enough, there they find a sword, a very ancient sword covered in corrosion. The corrosion wipes right off, revealing a beautiful sword from around the time of Charles Martel. Most people admit that Joan couldn't possibly have known that through any normal channels. Her voices told her. So again, this is pretty weird stuff. Either these are pious wonder tales fabricated to motivate the French army, or they really happened the way that independent attestation says they happened again and again. I don't claim to know the answer, but I do find it somewhat uncanny. Now, I know what you're thinking. Most of you, like me, are very skeptical of these kinds of claims. And frankly, I don't know where I come down on all this, but let me offer you one more piece of data that in my mind is much more difficult to explain away. And let me just say, after doing this research, I find almost everything about Joan very difficult to explain away, especially this. There is a letter that is postmarked, delivered at Brussels, duly registered, written from Lyon by a Sire de Rotslayer on 22 April 1429. So the provenance of this letter is established. This Sire de Rotslayer writes this about Joan. The maid, he said, quote, that she would save Orleans and would compel the English to raise the siege, that she herself in battle before Orleans would be wounded by a shaft, an arrow in other words, but would not die of it, and that the king in the course of the coming summer would be crowned at Reims, together with other things which the king keeps secret, end quote. Okay, so I know this is hard to follow, but this is what I'm saying. 8 days before Joan ever arrived in Orleans, before she had even a chance to try to break the siege, she came across this, apparently a Dutchman named Sire de Rotslayer, told him exactly what was going to happen at the siege and that the king was going to be coronated the following summer. This Dutchman is impressed with Joan and writes a letter on the 22nd of April, 1429, about what she told him. This letter from Sire de Rotslayer still exists at the public library in Brussels. After she tells Sire these things, and after he writes this letter and sends it to Brussels, the exact things Joan predicted would happen, happened. She was wounded by a shaft, and she didn't die. The siege was overthrown, and a summer later, Charles was indeed coronated at Reims. I don't know what the odds against exactly those things she predicted happening are, but they seem astronomical. This is indeed, and I keep using the word, it's uncanny. It's not only eerie, it's prodigious. Anyway, I'll get off that soapbox. So Joan is making her way to the siege at Orleans after getting Charles' blessing. On her way, she pens a letter to the English. Now, Joan was, by all accounts, illiterate, but she had the priest that followed in her retinue write the letter at her dictation. You get an idea of how full of hubris and confidence Joan was, despite being so young. She writes this letter, quote, Jesus Maria, King of England, you Duke of Bedford, who call yourself Regent of the Kingdom of France. She then addresses a few other lords among the English. And then, referring to herself in the third person, she says, surrender to the maid who is sent here by God, the King of Heaven, the keys of all the good towns which you have taken and violated in France. She, Joan again referring to herself, she is come here by God's will to reclaim the blood royal. She is very ready to make peace if you are willing to grant her satisfaction by abandoning France and paying for what you have held. And you, archers, men at war, gentlemen and others, who are before the town of Orleans, go away into your own country in God's name. And if you do not do so, expect tidings from the maid, who will come to see you shortly to your very great harm. So the English must have wondered who this girl who is breathing out these threatenings could possibly be. But she goes on, quote, I am a chieftain of war, and in whatever place I meet your people in France, I shall make them leave, and in whether they will it or not. And if they will not obey, I will have them all put to death. I am sent here by God, the King of Heaven, body for body, to drive you all out of France. And if they wish to obey, I will show them mercy. And be not of another opinion. For you will not hold the kingdom of France from God, the King of Heaven, Son of Saint Mary. For the King Charles will hold it, as is revealed to him by the maid. She goes on, if you do not believe these tidings from God and the maid, in whatever place we find you, we shall strike therein and make so great a tumult that none so great has been in France for 1,000 years. She goes on, basically trash-talking, threatening, and bragging for another few sentences, and then she concludes with this, answer if you wish to make peace in the town of Orleans, and if you do not, you will be reminded shortly to your very great harm. End quote. So where did Joan learn to write like this, talk like this, threaten and brag and bluster like this? It's hard to say, but the style seems to carry on in almost all of her letters. Joan absolutely did not lack for confidence and surety of her mission. Let's put it that way. Now, again, remember I said earlier that Joan changed the entire paradigm under which the 100 Years' War was fought. And this letter, in particular, all of her letters actually, provide ample evidence of how she did that. She turned it from a petty squabble among who would get the money from various places into a holy war. She rallied the soldiers of Charles to what essentially became a holy crusade for the glory of God and the glory of France. Now, that wasn't a strategy without some risk. These were both Catholic countries at the time. And if the French saw Joan as being sent by God, the English saw Joan as being sent by the devil. And if Charles did win, then his enemies could claim that he had earned his crown as a gift from the devil himself. And because everyone in that day was preoccupied and quite concerned with those kinds of appearances, Charles wanted to be sure that nobody could claim Joan was a sorceress, a devil. So he ordered a background inquiry and a theological examination of Joan's past. He sent what's called a commission of inquiry to Domremy. The commission completed its investigation in April 1429 and wrote, quote, "We declare her to be of an irreproachable life, a good Christian, possessed of the virtues of humility, honesty, and simplicity," end quote. They didn't claim the matter was totally resolved, though. They suggested that Charles give her a favorable presumption, and what that meant was, don't turn her away. Don't doubt her unless she gives you a reason to doubt her. Let's put her to the test. She claims she's going to lift the siege at Orleans. Let's see if she does. If she does as she predicted, then she must have been sent from God. If she fails to lift the siege as she predicted, then we don't know where she's from. We're not going to vouch for her. So Joan arrives at the end of April 1429 to the city of Orleans. And initially the leader of the city, one Jean d'Orleans, excludes her from all of the war councils, doesn't let her participate, doesn't want her opinion. Somehow, though, she finds her way into most of the war councils and all of the battles. Now, the extent of Joan's participation in the war is a matter of debate. She herself said she never killed a man. Nobody ever saw her kill a man in the battle either. Instead of wielding her sword, it seems that she waved her banner around, rallying the troops, telling soldiers where and when to attack, cursing and taunting the enemy. We do know a little bit about her banner because that was quite famous. At the top of every letter, Joan would write the words Jesus and Mary, Jesus, Maria. Well, on her banner, she also had the words Jesus and Maria. And the image she had was God the Father being presented a fleur-de-lis by kneeling angels. So it seems that that banner and her mouth were Joan's weapons during these battles. It has also been pointed out that she never directly commanded the armies. The armies were always directly commanded by a nobleman, such as the Duke of Alençon. But it's also true that these very selfsame nobles, the ones who were actually commanding the army, considered Joan invaluable, saying that they followed her advice in all things, believing that she was divinely inspired. Whatever the case was, the army had remarkable success during the time that Joan rode with it. The siege at Orleans had been going on for 5 months by the time Joan arrived. During those 5 months, the Armagnacs, the people of Orleans who had been besieged by the Burgundians and English, attempted only one offensive maneuver, and they were beaten back badly. So they were holed up in the city, hope was dwindling, food supplies were running out, and they were about to surrender by the time Joan got there. So Joan gets there at the end of April. By the 4th of May, the people of Orleans had attacked and captured an outlying fortress. By the 5th of May, they captured a second fortress. By the 6th of May, they'd attacked and captured a monastery called Les Augustins, with these 3 victories under their belt, one day after another. By the 7th of May, they decided that they would attack the main English stronghold. People who were at the battle say Joan was the heroine of the engagement. She rode up to the English stronghold, and she was hit by an arrow between her neck and shoulder. She had to retreat, but then the arrow was removed, and she returned later that same day to lead the attack. So there it is, just like she had predicted. She was wounded by an arrow. It didn't kill her. She led the attack that actually succeeded in capturing the English stronghold, and the siege broke the next day. So within a week and a half of Joan getting there, the siege was broken at Orleans. Joan had said to Charles that she would provide a sign, and that would be the breaking of the siege. The siege had been going on for 5 months, and within a week and a half of her getting there, the siege was broken. And of course, all of the sudden, archbishops and theologians were astonished at Joan's success. They jumped on her bandwagon. They proclaimed her as being sent from God. The English, on the other hand, said she was sent from the devil. And apparently they really believed it. According to the medievalist Beverly Boyd, the charge that Joan was sent from the devil wasn't just propaganda. After all, both armies thought God was fighting on their side, just like both sports teams do in a match today. But whether the English thought she was from God or the devil, the effect was the same. It was demoralizing. Now they think they're fighting the devil himself, a magical sorceress. Whatever they thought about Joan of Arc, the breaking of the siege at Orleans reverberated throughout France. It set off what came to be known as the Loire campaign. According to the commander at Orleans, Jean de Orleans, quote, "After the deliverance at Orleans, the Maid, with me and the other captains of war, went to seek the king who is in the castle at Loches to ask him for armed forces in order to recover the castles and towns situated on the river Loire. That is to say, Meung, Beaugency, Jargeau, so as to clear the way and make it safe for him to go to Reims for his coronation. The Maid urged the king eagerly and often to hasten and not to delay any longer." This was, of course, a very bold proposal. Reims was roughly twice as far away as Paris and deep within the Burgundian territory. But Joan's mission, the mission that she had been given by her voices, was not to retake Paris or some of the great cities of France, Rouen. It was to escort Charles to Reims, where he could be coronated. So that's exactly what Joan did. She proposed a campaign along the river Loire to open the way to Reims, where Charles could be crowned. To get an idea for how influential Joan was, for how her presence reversed the course of a demoralizing series of defeats, this Loire campaign was the first successful, sustained military French campaign in a generation during the 100 Years' War. And it was indeed very successful. The military portion of the campaign was led by a very capable leader, John II, the Duke of Alençon. But nobody denied that Joan was the inspiration behind it, the inspirational leader of this entire campaign. The Duke of Alençon himself accepted Joan's advice in almost everything, and there was a reason for that. And I have to shake my head again just to tell you this. Joan was standing with the Duke of Alençon outside the walls of Jargeau. From the Duke's own account, they were standing talking. Joan said to him, "You have to move, Lord. There's a cannon aiming right at you." As soon as he moved, a cannonball tore up the earth right where they had been talking. So to him, Joan had just saved his life. How do you ignore the advice of somebody like that? And although Joan did not actively kill anybody or participate in hand-to-hand combat, she was fearless. In fact, during that same siege, she rode right up to the wall of the town and somebody dropped a rock on her helmet. So for the second time, she was wounded in battle, and for the second time, she survived. So John II, the Duke of Alençon, and Joan rode through the Loire Valley, and every town that they came to, they took. Town after town yielded to them, opened their gates, and very few of their army were lost. No one wanted to stand against the Maid of Orleans or the Duke of Alençon. So this campaign went on through late May and early June, and by the 18th of June, the English had seen enough. This French army was coming. They decided they would retreat to Paris. So the army of Talbot leaves to the north from the Loire Valley. They expect to rendezvous with the army of Sir John Fastolf and then head to Paris. And the Duke of Alençon is unsure what to do. The English are retreating. Should he pursue them or should he let them go? Hold on to the ground that he'd already captured in the Loire Valley. He decided to ask Joan, and if you know anything about Joan, you probably know what her answer was. She said, "Have you any good spurs? There will be a need to ride boldly. We shall give a good account of the English, and our spurs will serve us famously in pursuing them." End quote. So, of course, Joan's advice was, go after the English. So the French army pursued the English army, and they met at the Battle of Patay. The English forces consisted of the army of John Talbot, joined by the army of Sir John Fastolf. The English set up various traps using their archers, which had worked so many times in the past. In fact, at Agincourt, the English archers had decimated the French army, and they were hoping to do the same thing again. Just before the battle was engaged, Joan said this, quote, "In God's name we must fight them. Even if the English hang from the clouds, yet we shall have them, for God sends us to punish them. Today the gentle Dauphin will have the greatest victory he has won for a long time. My voices have told me that the enemy will be ours." End quote. Danged if she wasn't right again. It was a rout, a slaughter. It was Agincourt in reverse. June 1849, the Battle of Patay. And I don't mean duck pate, I mean the village of Patay. You know how much the French hated and feared the English archers. These longbowmen could fire at a much more rapid rate than the French crossbow, and they could shoot a lot farther than the French archers. In fact, Henry V prized these archers so much that he would commute death sentences to allow them to come fight in his army. The French hated and feared them so much that whenever they captured one, they cut off the first 2 fingers from the hand that drew the bowstring. These English archers had been decisive in slaughtering the French at the Battle of Agincourt, and then once again at the Battle of Verneuil. Both of these defeats had been catastrophic for France, but this time during the Battle of Patay, the outcome would be very different. This time the French heavy cavalry charged a unit of English archers, broke them down, the archers began to run, and I hate to say it, it's pretty anticlimactic, but that was pretty much the end of the battle. After that, it was just English running and French chasing them down and killing them. Not much of a battle, but exactly what Joan had promised. 2,000 Englishmen were killed. Only 180 Frenchmen were killed. Talbot was captured. Fastolf ran off with his tail between his legs. In fact, he was later accused of cowardice and became the scapegoat for the disastrous Battle of Patay. So now the tide had effectively been turned on the entire English Burgundian army. The Loire campaign had resulted in the capture or killing of many of their field commanders. The Earl of Suffolk, the Earl of Salisbury, John Talbot, and the English would never recover their holdings in the Loire Valley again. Joan had accomplished everything she set out to do, and it was time for the coronation of the king. So Charles set out with his army on the 29th of June, headed toward Reims. And this was a glorious march. Along the way, they accepted the surrender of several Burgundian-held cities. In what must have been a sweet piece of irony, one of the cities that surrendered to the advancing army of Charles was the city of Troyes. Twain, if you want to say it in French. That's the exact city where the treaty had been signed that disinherited the Dauphin, and now he was taking it back. Joan wrote the following letter to the citizens of that city before they entered. Quote, "Very good and dear friends, if you don't mind, lords, bourgeois, and inhabitants of the town of Troyes, Joan the Virgin sends word and makes known to you in the name of the King of Heaven, her rightful and sovereign Lord, in whose royal service she remains each day, that you should render true obedience and recognition to the noble King of France, who will be in Reims and Paris quite soon, regardless of whomever may come out against us." She goes on once again bragging and threatening in very pious tones. And after 4 days, the city of Troyes, opened its gates to Charles. It's interesting, there's another minor miracle that occurs in that city. The army of Charles was very hungry by the time they arrived at the city gates. And as this was early summer, they couldn't expect very many crops to feed them. Well, as it so happened, there was a wandering friar named Brother Richard who had been preaching about the end of the world. He told the inhabitants of Troyes, don't plant crops that take very long to grow, because before they can ripen, Jesus will return. So the people of Troyes had planted beans which had a very early harvest. Right around the time that the army of Charles arrived, the beans became ripe and everybody ate. And in the words of Monty Python, there was much rejoicing. The army reached their destination, which was the town of Reims, on the 16th of July, 1429. So indeed, the following summer, from when Joan had prophesied she would lift the siege at Orleans, she had delivered Charles to the city of Reims. The actual consecration took place on the morning of July 17, 1429, with Joan famously standing right next to the king as he was coronated. And I think this is kind of touching. Joan's father had always been critical of her escapades, but he was there at the coronation of Charles. And what could he say? It was Joan's moment of greatest triumph. She had achieved everything the voices had told her to do, not even 2 years before that. That was the height of her power, her prestige, her influence. Just as you might predict, no sooner had the Dauphin been crowned king than he began to know better than everyone, better than Joan herself. Joan and the Duke of Alençon wanted to pursue their campaign against the English. They had them on the run. They wanted to drive them all the way out of France. The next stop in their plans would be Paris. It was time to march on Paris. Unfortunately, the royal court was not as bold. And in fact, they got played for fools. Charles got played for a fool. He wanted to negotiate a truce with the Duke of Burgundy as soon as he was crowned king. And so the Duke of Burgundy pretended to go along with it, pretended to meet with Charles in good faith, when the entire time he's really just stalling so he could reinforce Paris. So when Charles's army finally made it to Paris, after marching through the French countryside and accepting the surrender of many towns, they were attacked along the way at the Battle of Montpellier on 15th of August by the Duke of Bedford. That battle resulted in a standoff, but it too gave the Burgundians more time to fortify Paris against attack. The French assault on Paris didn't begin until the 8th of September. Joan was at that battle as well. This time she was hit by a crossbow bolt in her thigh. But Joan was indomitable. She wouldn't leave the scene of the battle. She had to be carried away from the front by one of the French commanders because she refused to leave. Well, after 1 day of fighting, the order came for the French army to leave. Withdraw. Joan was, of course, infuriated by this. She wanted to pursue an aggressive posture against the Burgundians and their English allies. But the newly crowned Charles VII, and his Grand Chamberlain especially, wanted peace. Most historians blame them for pursuing a failed policy that prolonged the war indefinitely. We do have to say, though, that Charles was not ungrateful to Joan. He valued the help that she had given him. So much so that on December 29th, 1429, he ennobled her family. Joan's father, Jacques d'Arc, became nobility, and she with him. I find it telling that Joan was told by her voices that she would help Charles get coronated at Reims. And during the entire time that she was achieving that goal, she seemed to have a divine mandate. But after she achieved that goal, it didn't seem like anything was as clear, anything was as good for her again. In fact, during the truce of early 1430, she had very little to do, so she turned her fury, her righteous indignation, on a group of proto-Protestants called the Hussites. This group of Bohemians had broken with the Roman Catholic Church, so Joan vented her frustration on them. She wrote the following letter, quote, "I tell you frankly, if I wasn't busy with these English wars, I would have come to see you a long time ago. But if I do not hear that you have reformed yourselves, I might leave the English behind and go against you, so that by the sword, if I cannot otherwise, I may eliminate your false and vile superstition." And she goes on and on. And I have to admit, if Joan did write this, and there is debate about that, if she did write it, she kind of lowered herself. It's kind of sad. It's one thing to breathe out wrath and threatening against an enemy you're about to take the field of battle against, one that has invaded your homeland, killed and subjugated your countrymen. But it's quite another thing to threaten a group of Protestants thousands of miles away just because you don't believe the same way they do. When you look at how Joan lived after the coronation of Charles VII at Reims, you can understand why many authorities on her life think that once her mission was accomplished, the mission that the voices had given her, she wanted to return home. But there's some evidence that she was detained with the army against her will. And the fact is that the evidence is mixed. While it's apparent that Joan wanted to pursue the speedy expulsion of the English from France, she also had a very hard time dealing with the apathy of the king and his counselors. They didn't seem to want to get it done. Even the siege of Paris, by the time the army got there, they were very poorly supported by Charles VII. His heart wasn't into taking Paris. And yet Joan and the Duke of Alençon risked their lives. Joan took a crossbow bolt through the thigh, trying to take Paris from the Burgundians and English. That's how game she was. She was so game that the Duke of Alençon had to practically drag her away from the battlefield, even though she had been horribly wounded. And the king's attitude was, oh, we lost? Okay, well, call it off. And imagine how somebody like Joan, somebody as straightforward and simple and to the point as Joan, would have fared in the royal court with all its petty backbitings, jealousies, little games that they played. Joan would not have thrived in that situation. And yet that's what Joan undoubtedly had to endure all the way through that early winter of 1430. It wasn't until spring, until April of 1430, that the truce with the English broke, and Joan would once again return to battle. And on the way, while she was at Melun, Joan's voices told her she would be captured by the English before the midsummer arrived. She was now 18 years old, still a very young girl, and there her voices told her that that would be her last free time, her last free summer. And even with that, Joan didn't turn back. She threw herself into the battle to attempt to break the siege on the town of Compiègne. The English were besieging the town. She arrived with an army to try to break the siege. She took one day to survey the scene, and in the evening of the 24th of May, she resolved she was going to attempt a sortie. She took with her 500 men, thinking that would be enough for a little skirmish, but unfortunately she encountered thousands of Burgundians. Joan and her sortie fight desperately. They have to make it back into the town of Compiègne to safety. But before they can get in, by some mistake or some panic, the commander of the city, a man named Guillaume de Flavy, closes the drawbridge with Joan still outside and many of her men. They were entirely overwhelmed, and it's then that Joan was pulled off of her horse by men in the service of John of Luxembourg, and she was captured. The Burgundians took her to the Beaurevoir castle. Joan wasn't done, though. She still had her fighting spirit. She made several attempts to escape. One time, in a famous attempt, she jumped out of her 70-foot tower, reasoning that the earth at the bottom of this dry moat would be very soft, and indeed she did survive. What kind of courage does it take to jump out of a 70-foot tower, no matter how soft you think the earth is below? Well, Joan did it, she survived, and she was recaptured. Now, it was well known that the English badly wanted Joan, and that they would pay to get her. But at one time, the Count John of Luxembourg said maybe he would ransom her to the French instead. Joan wasn't taking the bait. She knew that John of Luxembourg would sell her to the English, not return her to the French. She said to him, quote, "In God's name, Count, you mock me. Ransom, how you jest. You have neither the will nor the power to do so. I know well that these English will put me to death because they think that after I'm dead, they will win the kingdom of France. But even if there were 100,000 more soldiers than there are now, still they will never have the kingdom." End quote. So defiant right up until the end. Of course, the Burgundians did indeed negotiate with the English for Joan. The English ended up paying 10,000 livres for her, and she was transferred to the English city of Rouen. According to the historian Marc Didier, quote, "No words can adequately describe the disgraceful ingratitude and apathy of Charles and his advisors in leaving the maid to her fate. They made a few half-hearted attempts to rescue her, but if military force had not availed, they had prisoners like the Earl of Suffolk in their hands for whom she could have been exchanged." End quote. Most historians are outraged by the way Charles VII responded to the capture of Joan. He abandoned her. She had given him nothing short of a kingdom. In her span of fighting, she had broken the siege of Orleans, recaptured all of the towns along the Loire Valley, taken the king to Reims to be coronated, given the king the very sound advice that he should attack and drive the English from Paris immediately, then been wounded terribly herself, trying to help the king accomplish that goal. She had then stayed in the royal court, helping to maintain the prestige of the new King Charles VII during the time of truce, and as soon as the truce was broken, she jumped right back into the fray to try to help relieve a besieged town, and there she was captured. I want to make just two other points about Joan of Arc before we leave her life story. First one is this. Joan of Arc had a famously volatile temper. She did not hesitate to chew out anyone, from peasant to noble knight, if she saw them behaving indecently, swearing, skipping mass, dismissing her battle plans. She would go after them and give them a terrible tongue lashing. She wasn't afraid to use her hands either. In fact, one time when she was fighting alongside the Scots, who had notoriously bad manners, one of the Scots tried to eat a piece of stolen meat, and Joan slapped him across his face for his troubles. At times, she even used her sword, not to stab or kill anybody, but she would use the flat of the sword to swat away the mistresses and prostitutes that traveled with her army. It seems she also had a reputation for never backing down from a verbal altercation. In fact, if the English would taunt her, she would taunt them right back. And it made her furious that they called her a young girl, told her to go home to her cows. Even in the transcripts of her court hearings, you can tell that she had a short fuse and a sharp tongue. One of her questioners was a clergyman with a very thick regional accent, and he asked Joan, "What language do your voices speak to you in?" Joan replied, "They speak in French far better than you do." So Joan had quite a sharp temper, and I have to say, to the great admiration and amusement of the soldiers who traveled with her. The other thing that comes up with Joan of Arc is, was she schizophrenic? Was she epileptic? Were these visions a form of aura? Was she bipolar? Did she starve herself so badly that she had hallucinations? In other words, many people have tried to come up with naturalistic explanations for the phenomenon that was Joan of Arc. The simple fact is, not many people think these kinds of explanations or rationalizations are convincing when it comes to Joan of Arc. They aren't sufficient to explain her. Could she have been epileptic? Absolutely. Could she have been a little schizophrenic? Possibly. But there was no evidence of this in the rest of her life. And even if she was, you can't account for her for all that she was and accomplished by appealing to mental illness. And nowhere is this diagnosis of mental illness less sufficient than explaining Joan's prophecies. As I already alluded to, Joan prophesied many future events before they happened. Some of the better-known examples we've already covered. Remember, in 1429, she tells Robert of Baudricourt that the French have suffered a terrible defeat at the Battle of Orleans. Several days later, messengers arrive and tell Robert that exactly what Joan had said had happened did indeed happen. There was no way she could have gotten that information, though, because the messengers had just arrived bringing him that news. When she arrives at Chinon, she's able to pick out Charles the Dauphin, having never seen him before. She picks him out, though he's disguised among 300 other attendants. Then, when Charles offers her a sword, she says, "No, I don't want that sword. I want the sword of Charles Martel, buried in the chapel of St. Catherine of Fierbois." When the sword was found, it was exactly where she said it would be, and the blade was so covered in rust, it would have been impossible for her to describe it. But as the rust was wiped away, the blade looked exactly as Joan had described it. This one I'm not sure I covered. I might have. I don't remember. When she met Charles, she said to him, quote, "Make the most of me, as I will only last a year and a little more," end quote. And she was exactly right. And then there's that letter sent by Sire the Dutchman to Brussels on the 22nd of April, 1429, before Joan ever even arrived at Orleans, where she said the Maid would save Orleans, raise the siege, and that she herself would be wounded by a shaft but would not die of it, and that the king, in the course of the coming summer, would be crowned at Reims. For me, this is the most uncanny of Joan's predictions. And Joan said essentially the same thing to other people along the way. At Joan's retrial, Father Jean Pasquerel testified that she had said to him right before the siege of Orleans, quote, "Tomorrow blood shall flow from my body above the breast," end quote. And if you remember, she was wounded between her shoulder and neck that next day. And then in 1430, as Joan was riding to relieve the Burgundian siege, her voices told her while she was still in Melun that she would be taken prisoner before midsummer. And I'll give you one more example. In Joan's trial on the 1st of March, 1431, and we'll get to Joan's trial, she announced that within 7 years, the English would suffer a far greater defeat than they had suffered at Orleans, and they would lose everything in France. That is 1431. Within 7 years, you're going to have a much greater defeat. 6 years and 8 months later, Paris was lost to Henry VI on the 12th of November, 1437. These are some of the major prophecies that Joan made, but she made countless smaller prophecies. For example, when she told the Duke of Alençon to move because a cannon was aimed right at him, which ended up saving his life because as soon as he moved, a cannonball tore up the ground where he had been standing. So again, I don't know what to make of that. What do you make of that? How do you process that information? Was Joan truly clairvoyant? Could she really see the future? Could her voices tell her things that were going to happen? Or are these maybe exaggerations based loosely on events that occurred in her life? Or are they utter fabrications designed to terrify the English? I don't know how to explain them. They seem miraculous. And of course, David Hume had a famous argument against miracles. He said, whenever you hear a story about a miracle, you have to decide whether a miracle is more likely to have happened. In other words, is it more likely that a totally prodigious event that has never happened before or since in all of nature actually occurred, or whether somebody lied? What's more likely? In most every single case, it's more likely that somebody lied. But I'm not sure that argument holds in the case of Joan of Arc. And what's most amazing of all is that it wasn't even these prophecies that secured her place in history. It was actually her accomplishments. It was the way in which she said she was going to do something fabulous and incredible. And then she went out and did it. This concludes this episode of the History of Being Human podcast. Thank you again for listening. Next time we'll take up the trial of Joan of Arc.